Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Missouri Trailblazers program on Redd Foxx, brought to you today by the Missouri State Museum. My name is Pam, and I'm the branch lead here at the Holt Summit Public Library, which is a branch of the Daniel Boone Regional Library. Joining me today is Lauren, who is the Adult and Community Services Manager for Daniel Boone. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Pam.
Okay, before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to go over a few Zoom housekeeping items with you. On your Zoom screen, if you hover or tap, you should see a raised hand icon and a chat bubble icon. Everyone's microphones are currently muted. If you'd like to ask a question at the end of the presentation, select the hand icon and Lauren will unmute you. You can also enter your questions and comments into the chat, which I will be keeping an eye on throughout the program. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available on the museum's Facebook page and the library's YouTube channel after it has been edited. If you're watching with a group, please let us know how many are watching at your location by putting it into the chat. Today's program is a continuation of our Missouri Trailblazers series, featuring trailblazers who have impacted Missouri. I would like to say a special thank you to the Missouri State Museum for their partnership in organizing these presentations. Okay, let's get started. Today's program is about Redd Foxx, previously stated. This afternoon, we want to welcome back Carrie Hammond. Carrie Mackie Hammond started her museum career in 2012 as an educator and exhibition research team leader in a small paleontology museum in the southwest part of Missouri. She then joined the Missouri State Museum in 2016 as their education specialist and stayed in that role until earlier this year when she became the Missouri State Museum's chief interpreter, which oversees the museum's education department. She recently became the co-author of a history book featuring a selection of interesting women from Jefferson City, and in the future aims to become one of Missouri's historical leads in the art of using natural dyes. Carrie, we want to welcome you today. Would you like to say a few words about what's going on in at the museum before you start your wonderful program?
Thank you, Pam. Recently, we have installed 2 new exhibits, one being Missouri Made, which highlights Missouri jobs and products made here in our state. The second is an exhibit project made by students at Lincoln University titled Trials and Tribulations, which focuses on making some new Black content for the Missouri State Museum. So definitely the students have put a lot of hard work into this project, and we're very proud to showcase this for them, and that it will eventually be a part of kind of a broader scope of us expanding the museum and becoming more diverse and inclusive. And as always, we provide educational resources to the citizens of Missouri by way of traveling trunks, traveling exhibits, programming such as this one, and tours of both the Missouri State Capitol and Jefferson Landing State Historic Site. So if Pam or someone could put a link to our website in the chat, that would be great. And we hope to see some of you come visit us. So we are going to talk about Redd Foxx today. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second here. There we go. Now I can see it. All right. Now, Redd Foxx has been described as naturally funny, sharp-witted, and authentic. He was generous to a fault, a poor businessman, a terrible manager of money, and someone that would give anyone the shirt off his back. He challenged society today and stood up for himself and those around him. Comedian Dick Gregory was quoted as saying, "Foxx was one of the fastest comedic minds on the planet." And actress Della Reese described him as God's pure humor and said Redd never received the respect and recognition he deserved. And after doing the research for this program, I would agree with that. Now, Redd Foxx was born in St. Louis, Missouri on December 9th, 1922, with the name John Elroy Sanford. His parents were Fred Glenn Sanford and Mary Alma Hughes Sanford. John had a big brother, Fred G. Sanford Jr., and two sisters who died in infancy. The family lived in a St. Louis slum and were very poor. His father was an electrician by trade, but spent a portion of his paychecks at the local pool halls. What was left of the money he earned was barely enough to keep the family afloat. The brothers John and Fred Jr. were very close, but were not particularly close to either one of their parents. Now, this was due to Fred Sr. abandoning the family when the boys were very small, and he never came around again. And as a result of that, Mother Mary had to work very long hours to support them. At one point, Mary became so desperate that she left St. Louis for Chicago to find work, and she left the boys in St. Louis with her mother, their grandmother. And for some reason, John greatly resented this and harbored those ill feelings for the rest of his life. Now, at this time, the boys essentially began raising themselves on the streets. Mary decided to enroll them at the Moore Mansion in Milwaukee, which was an all-Black Catholic boarding school founded in 1908. However, John did not do very well in school. He was incredibly homesick. He kind of became unruly. He was known as the class clown. So he really was not focused on academics at all. His time at the school, it only lasted a little less than 2 years before the school essentially returned him to his grandmother's in St. Louis, and that was in 1931. And his older brother, Fred Jr., followed a year later for the same reason. Now, even though he was back home in St. Louis, John continued to do poorly in school, and he was actually expelled in the 5th grade. So he started his little bit of unruly behavior pretty young. At this point, his grandmother had had enough of his shenanigans, and so she shipped him to his mother in Chicago. And when he reunited with his mother, she was actually living in a small 1-bedroom apartment, so not very conducive for having children with her. So when he wasn't in school, he was running the streets, and he would make a little money here and there by handling errands for the people in his Chicago neighborhood. And he and his friends would play a game known as the Dozens, where they would see who could do the best job of insulting each other. And the insults could be about a variety of things, but it's believed that this is where the notorious "Yo Mama" jokes originated. So I'm sure most of us were probably familiar with those jokes, especially from earlier days. And this is likely where his future in comedy really kind of began to take off. Now, he attended DuSable High School, and that was in Chicago. And during that time, he became a part of the 58th Street Gang, which was a group of young thugs that were notorious for both fighting and neighborhood crime. And of course, the picture I have here is not specifically of the 58th Street Gang. As far as I know, none of those exist, but this is a gang of young people from that same era. So that's why I wanted to include that photograph. But he was not only involved in criminal activity, he also formed a band with a few of his friends, and they spent time performing on street corners in the neighborhood. Now, John dropped out of DuSable in 1938 when he was just 16 years old. And this is when he and his bandmates decided to take their show on the road to New York City, because why wouldn't they, of course? Fred Jr. dropped the band off at the train station, and John and his bandmates began their journey. So what they did was they stowed away in freight cars as they made their way east to New York. However, as they passed through New Jersey, John's fellow band members were apprehended as suspects in a breaking and entering incident. John, though, was able to escape by boat and completely get away. So not sure quite how he managed to do that, but he did. He actually ended up in Harlem, and he stayed there and waited for his bandmates to be released from jail. Now, John never actually talked about how he survived that time alone on the streets of Harlem, but it is suspected that he spent it sleeping on rooftops and stealing food. Now, after arriving in New York, John became known on the streets as Chicago Redd due to his red hair. So I think most of us know him probably from his older days when his hair was gray. But when he was a young man, he actually had red hair. So that kind of set him apart. So that is where he picked up that nickname Chicago Redd. Now, once settled in New York City, John and his friends added a couple of more young men from the neighborhood they were living in to the band. At this point, they had gained enough confidence with their music that they began to attend auditions under the name Jumping Swinging Six. And they actually won a coveted spot on a popular radio show called Major Beau's Original Amateur Hour, which essentially could be labeled as today's American Idol. You know, for that time frame, it was kind of the same thing. This was actually the same show that gave Frank Sinatra and his Hoboken gang their start. So it was a pretty big deal for them. Now, despite finishing second to last in the show voting, a recording of the song they performed is currently kept in the Library of Congress. So that's a pretty good feat for those young fellas. Now, the band continued to play on the streets until the emergence of World War II came along and ended the group. So while his bandmates left to join the fight, Redd, who admitted he was less patriotic than his bandmates, faked heart troubles to dodge the draft. So after the Jumping Swinging Six broke up, John, now known as Redd, formed a new band which performed at the Apollo, but disbanded shortly after. So that was another pretty significant feat for them to get a gig at the Apollo. But since they disbanded right after that, it got to where Redd really wasn't able to afford a stable place to live. So he essentially became homeless. And this is when he turned to drugs and crime. And he was eventually arrested, and he spent time in several different places, a couple of which are Tombs Jail Complex in Manhattan and Rikers Island on the East River. Now, after his stints in jail, Redd actually took a job washing dishes at Jimmy's Chicken Shack, a now infamous little food joint in a brownstone in Harlem that is considered the birthplace of bebop. Now, this is where Chicago Redd met two new friends, Detroit Redd, born Malcolm Little and famously known later as Malcolm X, and the future jazz saxophonist Charlie Yardbird Parker, who were both working at the Chicken Shack as well. The two Redds became fast friends, committing petty crimes and getting in fights with other gangs of young men. And during their friendship, Malcolm began delving into more serious crimes. And he was actually sentenced to several years in prison. And this is where he joined the Nation of Islam and took on the name Malcolm X. Now, upon his release from prison, Malcolm X became a leader in the Black nationalism movement and the pursuit of racial justice. Now, Redd, who was more interested in having fun than politics, quickly grew apart from his dear friend. However, Redd said in later interviews that Malcolm was the only person he ever really trusted. Now, along the way, Redd picked up another nickname, Foxy. Now, this was due to his love of sharp dress, which you'll see in some of the later on pictures, and his way with the ladies. Now, he decided to combine the two nicknames to form the persona Redd Foxx. Now, he added the extra letters to each word because he felt like it would look better that way on a marquee, and he admired ball player Jimmy Foxx. Now, comedian Jamie Foxx, who was born in 1967, and his name was Eric Bishop, and of course, he's kind of in the peak of his career right now. He actually chose his name, Jamie Foxx, as his stage name. And he chose the last name Fox to pay homage to Redd Foxx because he was his biggest influence. Now, Redd traveled to Baltimore, where he was hired to MC at a club for an all-Black audience, and was soon known as the funniest act in town. His comedy career immediately took off, and he began to formulate his delivery style. He was willing to talk about more taboo subjects, improvise, pick on audience appearance, and he used the African-American folk tradition of humor and mimicry in his routine. And so that gave him a really good connection with his audience that kind of set him apart from other comedians. Now, initially, he kept his routine fairly tame in the hopes of booking larger venues. However, it didn't take him very long to realize that no matter what the content of his performance was or what it included, that larger venues would never hire him at that time due to him being Black. Now, in response to this, he began using language of the street, kind of with an off-the-cuff style, and spoke directly to his Black audiences. He became the king of the not-so-subtle innuendo and considered one of the first urban Black comics. And he inspired the likes of Richard Pryor, Melvin Slappy White, and fellow St. Louis native Dick Gregory. In 1948, Redd was bitten by the love bug. Seems to get us all at one time or another. Little is known about Redd Foxx's first wife, Evelyn Killebrew, other than that they married 5 days after meeting, and that her father gave them a house in New Jersey to begin their married life. Unfortunately, though, they were kicked out of this house when caught growing marijuana and moved back to Harlem. Now, once back in familiar territory, Redd formed a comedy show with fellow comedian Melvin Slappy White. They took their show on the road not long after, and Redd and Evelyn decided to divorce. So their marriage only lasted about 3 years. Now, Redd began doing stand-up act on the Chitlin Circuit, which was a collection of performances by, for, and about the Black community during racial segregation. Now, he was doing okay on the Chitlin Circuit, but he couldn't seem to break into white audience venues. Now, James Brown, Tina Turner, and Jimi Hendrix all also spent time performing for the Chitlin Circuit. So that was also a pretty big deal. So he seemed to be kind of hitting these really important milestones over and over again when he began his career, but he really just could not seem to break forth and get out of that mold that he was in. And he performed his comedy act without reproach, and his audience absolutely loved him. So he definitely had some incredible talent. And during one of his performances, he was noticed by a record producer, Dootsy Williams, who offered to record him doing his act. And Redd agreed, and seemed to be kind of when his career started to gain some traction. Now, as he perfected his stage act, Redd also did the same with his artwork. He was an avid sketcher who almost always had a pen and paper on him and would amuse himself by drawing. One drawing, labeled Self-Portrait, became the cover art for one of his first records titled Laugh of the Party Volume 1. This record was distributed nationally, where it became a hit on college campuses and among Black teenagers. Now, white record shops also began selling it, but it was usually kept behind the counter, and customers typically had to ask for it due to Redd's crass comedic style. And groups of friends began gathering together in the evenings and having what were called listening parties, where they would eat, drink, laugh, and listen to Redd's records. So it kind of became a pretty significant thing for the culture at the time. Now, Redd became known as the king of party records in the Black press, and an underground superstar was born. The record label then released Laugh of the Party Volume 2, which continued Redd's underground success. During this same time, Redd began a whirlwind romance with a young woman named Betty Jean Harris. Betty and her two sisters worked as singers and dancers at the same nightclub where Redd was performing his stand-up act. Betty later said she didn't initially like Redd's loud personality, but she eventually warmed up to him and they began dating. And apparently that was after about a year of her warming up. According to Redd, though, it was love at first sight, and he knew he would marry her one day. So after a few years of dating, they did in fact marry. However, Redd had set a condition with his proposal, that Betty would give up her career and become a housewife. And she agreed to that, and a few years later was quoted as saying, while she loved having a career, she loved being Mrs. Redd Foxx even more. And I thought that was pretty endearing. And she ended up handling all of Redd's business affairs and finances to help him out with that. But Betty also had a young daughter named Deborah from a previous relationship, and Redd actually adopted her as his own child. Now, between 1956 and 1958, Redd released approximately 25 party records, and it wasn't long before Dootsie presented him with a gold record for selling 1 million albums. But even with the success of his party records, Redd struggled to break into mainstream clubs. Now, 2 years later, Redd signed a deal to give a show at the Crescendo Club, which was a lucrative club on the Sunset Strip. Now, this was a big deal because at that time, it was very rare for Black performers to be invited to work on the Strip. So he was definitely blazing a trail for this. And while it was difficult for him because of his adult-themed style of comedy, other Black comedians of his generation really began to rise in fame and were asked to play for wider white audiences. And some even earned write-ups in the New York Times Magazine. So according to inside sources, privately, Redd was livid that they were making headway when he wasn't. So it was kind of heartbreaking for him. But publicly, he praised them and really thanked them for helping form a path for those that were following them. But I guess on a personal level, he felt like he was putting in the same work, but was not gaining traction. But he didn't want to, give up who he was and his own personal style. Now, finally, in 1964, Redd caught a bit of a break. He made his first television appearance on the Today Show, and he was able to perform on live television. It is said that his humor was appropriate and that he nailed the performance. Now, I don't know if that means he toned down his normally crude act or if the mainstream audience had finally embraced his style. I was not able to find any further information on that to know for sure. But either way, he was a hit, and so that was really good for him. Now, shortly after his appearance on the Today Show, he was asked to be a special guest on the John Barber Show. Now, John Barber had been a fellow comedian from Redd's stand-up days, so they knew each other from them. And Barber considered Redd to be kind of a mentor to him. And he had very fond memories and said that Redd had really helped him with his stand-up quite a bit. And so he wanted to return the favor by putting Redd on television since he now had his own show. So I think that was helpful for him. Was there any resentment in there? I don't know. I've not been able to find anything about that. But he went on the show, so I guess there couldn't have been too much resentment there. Now, Redd was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson several times over the next few years, which helped him get additional exposure. However, his record label was floundering at that time, and that actually caught the attention of Frank Sinatra. Now, Sinatra was a fan of Redd, and he jumped into action to assist. So he bought out Redd's contract from the failing record company and offered him a contract with Loma Records. And Loma Records was the R&B offshoot of Sinatra's Reprise Records. Now, this record label finally kind of allowed him access to bigger and better gigs at larger hotels. And now, instead of just a secondary act, he could be billed as the main act. So that was also a pretty significant thing for him. And he remained with this label for the next 3 records before he set out essentially on his own. Now, Redd made his prime time debut with several of his fellow Black comedians in a special series from Studio 67 that aired on ABC. Now, the series was called 100 Years of Laughter. I believe a few years after that, or maybe the next year, it was renamed to be something that was quite a bit longer, but that is the original name that it started with. Now, this special opened him up to getting photo shoots for magazines such as Ebony and Jet, and gained him a steady stream of Vegas shows. And he spent the next several years putting out additional party records, buying and poorly running a Los Angeles nightclub, and entertaining the likes of Richard Pryor and Bill Cosby, and kind of living the high life. Now, he only had this nightclub for a few years before it burned down. It was during the same time that he became close friends with Elvis Presley. Actually, Redd was the only celebrity that was invited to the private ceremony between Elvis and Priscilla when they married. And there was actually a picture of that I did find on the web. However, it had a great big watermark over the center of it. And so even if I had wanted to use that, it wouldn't have looked very good for you all to see, but you're welcome to, of course, Google that yourself and see that picture. But apparently Elvis, he liked Redd so much that at one point he bought him a diamond bracelet, and another point he bought him a diamond necklace. So he was definitely, kind of showering him with special gifts because he respected him and enjoyed his work so much. Now, he signed in 1969, he signed on to play a supporting role in the movie Cotton Comes to Harlem. And he also worked with his manager on a concept for a cooking show. So some of you may have seen some recent cooking shows. I think there's Selena and Chef and a few others. And it's funny when I read about this, this was back in the late 60s. And the concept that they were putting together for the show is exactly like some of the shows that we have right now on TV. So I thought that was pretty incredible, and how much kind of foresight that they had to do shows that way. Now, this show, kind of the premise for it was, since Redd loved to cook, that he would have celebrity guests come to his house to visit, and they would shoot pool, and Redd would make them a home-cooked meal while they were playing billiards. And so it never did come to pass, unfortunately, because I think that probably would have been some comedy gold for the archives for us. But nonetheless, it's interesting that they had that same concept that we have today. Now, in 1972, Redd was cast for a remake of the British show called Steptoe and Son. The American version named the lead character after Redd's real last name of Sanford and Redd's late brother, Fred Jr. Now, Redd had actually approached the producer for the show and asked if he could name the character in memory of his brother. Now, Fred Jr., the whole time this had been going on with Redd trying to make his way in comedy, Fred Jr. had actually been in and out of prison most of his life. And he actually passed away from a rare kidney disorder and diabetes complications at age 46. And I could not get a definite on it, but I believe he was actually in prison at the time that he passed. Now, supposedly, after this happened, Redd would go visit his brother's grave at least once a year and spend some time there with him. Now, Redd named the character playing his son, Lamont, after one of his former bandmates. And the producer agreed to all of this, and that is when Sanford and Son was born. Now, Redd spoke his mind to the show's writers and producers. He refused to play stereotypes or go for cheap laughs, and he often hired Black comedians from his Chitlin Circuit days to appear on the show. Now, the show's ratings consistently ranked it high in a fight for first place with All in the Family, which was all the rage at the time. Now, Redd knew that there was a chance he would face backlash for a show about two poor Black men. But his granddad and uncle were junkers, and they were proud to work for themselves and own their own business. And so he wanted to, show people that that is something to be proud of. Now, following in line with the skit that he had used much of his life, the character of Redd Sanford frequently faked heart attacks for dramatic effect and to kind of get his way in life. So I'm going to play this little clip for you. So if anyone is not super familiar with Sanford Son, you get to see kind of an ongoing joke. And then for those of us that are familiar with it, it'll be a nice little revisit.
Give me my money, no. I said no. No, I want my money. I said no. I got it out of here. I might need that money tonight. I've never had pain like this before. Oh, this is the first one I ever had, son. Oh, it's the first one. This is a big one. I'm dying. You hear that, Elizabeth? I'm coming to join you, honey. Hey, that's Elizabeth.
There we go. Okay, so yeah, that was an ongoing skit in there, which kind of becomes ironic when you get to the program, if you're not familiar with Redd Foxx. But there was a lot of, when I was doing research for this and trying to pick out video clips, I will say I could absolutely not use anything from his stand-up routine. No way. And so I was like, well, let me try to pull something from Sanford Son. And aside from this one clip, there was a lot of even that I didn't feel comfortable using, on a daytime program. So I was like, well, maybe if I ever do a nighttime, an after hours program, I could pull some of those videos. But yeah, that he was definitely breaking new ground as far as, sitcom television in that time. Now, with the success of Sanford & Son, Redd was an instant celebrity. He was followed and harassed everywhere. So those wanting to watch a videotaping of his show had to wait in really long lines to get in. And he even landed a feature in the New York Times. So it's kind of like, finally, Sanford & Son got him to that point where he really felt like he should be. Now, he was nominated in 1972 and then won in 1973 a Golden Globe for his best performance as an actor in a comedy series for his portrayal of Fred Sanford. He beat out the likes of Alan Alda for MASH, Bill Cosby for The Cosby Show, and several other high-profile sitcom actors. He was then nominated for additional Golden Globes each year until the end of the series. The NAACP awarded Redd with their Entertainer of the Year award in 1973. And in 1974, Redd and his wife of 18 years, Betty Jean, divorced, citing irreconcilable differences. In 1976, ABC offered Redd Foxx his own variety show, the Redd Foxx Comedy Hour. Now, this was something he had always wanted. And he also married his third wife, Yun Chin Chung, known as Joy, that same year in Las Vegas. Unfortunately for Redd, ABC pulled the plug on his variety show after only 1 year, and his marriage to Joy was fairly short-lived. In 1976, the IRS came to collect a large amount of Redd's assets. It wasn't because he didn't file his taxes. He did file his taxes. He just never paid them. So it was not tax fraud. It was like just a big snub to the government that he wasn't going to pay them. But Redd was a big dog lover. So, man after my own heart there. When they came to collect his assets, he begged them not to take his dogs because his dogs were essentially the only thing he had left. But not one to be kept down, Redd returned to TV once again in 1980 with the start of his sequel to Sanford Son, simply called Sanford. This show would only run for 2 seasons, which was unfortunate, but Redd filed for bankruptcy in 1982. I think that might have been able to get him out of a little bit of trouble that he was in. Now, in 1986, he renewed his work with ABC and premiered a new show called The Redd Foxx Show, which was supposed to compete with the new popular sitcom of The Cosby Show that was in its 2nd season. However, his new show was canceled only after 3 months on the air. So I'm not really sure if that was strictly, I know part of it was low ratings, but I'm not sure if there was anything else involved in that or not. Now, in 1988, popular comedian and actor Eddie Murphy wrote a role in his upcoming movie Harlem Nights, specifically for Redd. So, because Murphy cited Redd as one of his biggest inspirations. So we kind of see a theme as we go along with all of these new comedians and actors about how even though he was not mainstream or felt like he was not mainstream enough, he was still influencing all of these people that were following behind him. So a lot of times I think people have a bigger impact on others than they realize. Now, in 1991, Redd married again for the 4th time to a woman named Ka Ho Cho. When asked about why he married again, Redd essentially said something to the effect that she stood by him when he only had a quarter, so he figured she would stand by him when he had $1. And if he did have $1, he would give her 75 cents. So essentially he was saying that even when he had nothing, she was there for him. So good for her and good that he had that love in his life. Now, this was around the same time that Redd's friend Eddie Murphy gave him a spot on a new show that he was producing called The Royal Family. The show also starred actress Della Reese. And then on October 11th, 1991, not long after the show had begun, while rehearsing a scene with Della for the Royal Family, Redd collapsed. With a lifelong series of pranks involving heart attacks and pretend falls, at first Redd's co-stars thought he was joking. It wasn't until Della Reese bent down to ask him if he was okay and heard him say, "Get my wife," twice, that she began to shout for paramedics. Redd was rushed to the hospital, but there was nothing they could do to save him. It is reported that due to Redd's financial trouble, his wife was not able to pay for his funeral. Like most of Redd's friends, Eddie Murphy thought so much of the late comedian that he stepped in and paid for everything, giving Redd the lavish and star-studded send-off he deserved. Redd's obituary in the New York Times called him a cantankerous master of bawdy humor, and his influence on the comedians of his day has carried on through the sitcoms and stand-up routines we have now. Now, Redd was given a star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame in 1992. Now, I don't know about you all, but I was not even aware that St. Louis had a Walk of Fame. But now that I know about it, I'm definitely going to seek it out and see if I can check that out and go say hi to Redd Foxx's star. All right, thank you. If there's any questions, please let me know.
Okay, that was very fascinating. My first question is, do you know where the St. Louis Walk of Fame is located? Is it downtown?
I do not know, but I am going to find out because that sounds super cool. But I would imagine it probably is downtown.
Okay. It's on Del Mar.
Oh, okay. I have a few questions for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. You said that Redd Foxx's band played on Major Bow's Amateur Hour and that the song is kept at the Library of Congress. Do you know what song it is that they played?
Yeah, they actually played, it's called The Sheik of Araby. It was written by Harry B. Smith and Francis Wheeler, and the music was by Ted Schneider. Apparently, it went along with a movie that had come out at the same time called The Sheik, and it was a Rudolph Valentino feature film. So it was apparently a big deal in 1921, and so yeah, that is the song they took from that movie to play. And let me see if I can. I was actually listening to a version of it earlier today. See if I can. I don't know if it's on my list to share or not, but I don't see it. But yeah, I just looked at a YouTube, and it was from the 1920s. There was a version on YouTube, and it was great. It was of course in black and white, and they had the whole set was decked out in the theme, but they were doing a comedy skit along with it when they were singing. So it's definitely, if you're interested in hearing it, it's definitely pretty fun to watch that little video clip that they have.
Do you happen to know whether he had any influence on the theme song for Sanford and Son or not?
I don't know. I never came across anything like that as far as the theme song. So I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did with his musical background.
Okay, I'm looking to see if anybody wants to ask a question. You can let us know or type it in the chat, but I'll go ahead and ask another question. Was Redd Foxx on any sitcoms before Sanford and Son?
He actually wasn't, but there was a rumor that he was. And what happened was there was somebody that had appeared on some shows like Green Acres, Addams Family, Beverly Hillbillies, and this person was billed as John J. Fox. One X, no two X's on the end, but because his name was originally John Sanford and then he went by Redd Foxx, somehow people would put that together and see the John J. Fox and assume that was him. And so for billing, a lot of times it would get confusion, and he would be, they would say, well, this is Redd Foxx, and it wasn't until they would go and watch the actual show they would realize it wasn't him. So it's a myth, I guess you'd say, that he was on any others, but no, Sanford and Son was his first one.
Lauren, you want to ask your question?
Oh, sure. So you mentioned Eddie Murphy and him writing a part for Redd Foxx and Harlem Nights and being one of the comedians that Redd Foxx influenced. I think I remember hearing that Eddie Murphy paid for Redd Foxx's tombstone or something, or helped out.
Well, he paid for the entire funeral.
Oh, okay.
And the headstone was part of that as well, yes. But because Redd was so bad with money and had such a desire to help other people, he was constantly, if somebody was out of work or needed something, he was literally reaching into his pocket to pull out money for them. And I assume that kind of stemmed from, his childhood. And of course, the snubbing of the taxes and things did not help that situation at all. But, so by the time that he did pass away, he really had very, very little. And, and his wife, I don't know what her background was, but I don't know if she had any type of income, if she was a housewife, and, not being able to pay for his funeral. And Eddie Murphy stepped in and took care of everything. So I imagine it was everything from start to finish.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Did you, Carrie, say that he had a child early on in a relationship?
His second wife, Betty Jean Harris, that he was married to for 18 years, she had a daughter, Deborah, I think is how you pronounce it. And she was, I think, 9 years old when Redd and Betty married, and he adopted her to become his own child. But however, even though he raised her as his own, apparently she married a couple of years after Redd and Betty Jean divorced, and apparently he did not attend the wedding. So I guess there was probably some ill will there. Well,
that was my follow-up question, if they still had a connection or not. But Do you know why Redd was expelled from school in 5th grade?
Well, according to the school, it was because he threw a book at a teacher. However, in his recollection, that was a self-defense book throw, that the book was actually thrown at him by the teacher and he returned the favor. And that is when he was expelled.
Well, I grew up watching Redd. I don't know if you did. It sounds like you did. Is there anything that you learned about him that you found to be quite interesting, or anything else that you would like to share with us?
Oh, just everything. I mean, I didn't know, my dad used to love Sanford and Son, and I remember watching it as a kid, but I didn't know anything about him as a man. I just knew that he was funny and, had a junk store, or a junker. And just knowing, especially I think the way he grew up, having to be on the streets so young and taking care of himself. And I think it's something that a lot of people have struggled with when they're young and they don't know where their next meal is coming from. And, they don't have shelter. And, if you think about it, it wasn't like he was in the South where it was warm all the time. He was in the North where the winters are very brutal, and, he had to figure out how to survive, as a young person in all different types of environments. And that really had to shape him, and make him very well-rounded.
I love that he had the influence on comedians that are still in the field today, and his legacy still continues. So yeah, that's exciting.
I had no idea about, his timeline seems to have overlapped with so many interesting people, Malcolm X and, Frank Sinatra. And I didn't realize that he, had us, career singing some. I just fascinating that he's
and that Elvis, he and Elvis, yeah. It's incredible to know about, all the lives that he touched. And, it would be interesting to know what his thoughts would be today, to see, the impact that he's had. Because during his life, he had no idea, I don't think.
Yeah, he may not have left an inheritance, but he had left quite a legacy. He had a huge impact on a large number of people.
Yes, he sure did.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Come check out the Missouri State Museum website. You can check out the library's website for past events and the upcoming events. We would like, if you have the opportunity, to join us again in November for another Missouri Trailblazer program. This time, we're going to be highlighting Kansas City's puppet phenomenon, Hazel Hedges Rollins. So please join us. I believe that's November 15th for that. You can see the link there in the chat. Carrie, we want to thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with us. And we want to wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. And thank you again. Bye.